So, the first topic that we will be discussing from the Great Depression is the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was a series of intense storms that threatened 100 million acres of land as a result of drought and poor farming techniques. The federal government had encouraged settlement in the Midwest, starting with the Homestead Act of 1862. After an unusually fertile season in the 1920s, scientists formulated a theory that human habitation and agricultural development permanently changed the climate in arid regions, making them more humid. The Dust Bowl occurred in the western third of Kansas, southeastern Colorado, the Oklahoma Panhandle, the northern two-thirds of the Texas Panhandle, and northeastern New Mexico. The first image that we will be looking at, pictured right over here, is from April 14th, 1935, and it captures an event known as Black Sunday. Now, the dust storm took over the sky and turned day into night. This can be attributed to the exposed, plowed soil blowing away in huge dust clouds called black blizzards or black rollers. Many believe that the world was coming to an end. By capturing this image, the photographer likely wanted to capture the uncertainty and the ominous times that were created through the Dust Bowl. And the next image, pictured right over here, depicts women with dust pneumonia, using masks to protect themselves from the overwhelming dust particles. The dust filled people's lungs, leading many to develop dust pneumonia. Symptoms included high fever, chest pains, coughing, and breathing difficulties, killing many. The photographer likely intended to portray the scary, underworld feeling with people wearing masks that made them look like they belonged to a World War I battlefield. And the third image, pictured right over here, captures the migrant mother during the Great Depression. It reflects the hardship that the displaced families face as they were forced to migrate. A woman in ragged clothing holds a baby, or as two or more children huddle close, hiding their faces behind her shoulders. She symbolized hunger, poverty, hopelessness that many of the Americans faced. Dorothy Lange, the photographer, was working for the federal government's Resettlement Administration, in which she helped spread awareness about the thousands of people that were being displaced from the Dust Bowl.
This next topic, we'll be talking about the soup kitchens and breadlines of the 1930s Great Depression. Unemployment during the Great Depression left many of the American people of the 1930s unable to afford anything, the neediest and most affected of which being unable to afford basic meals. An initial lack of aid by the Hoover administration saw the rise of soup kitchens that were owned and run by private organizations that provided food to thousands of hungry people per day. Mostly in cities, soup kitchens were run by charities and churches out of the pockets of those who organized them, and up until the mid-1930s, when state and federal governments began opening up their own unemployment relief programs, the soup kitchens of charities and churches were the only places for hungry people to obtain a hot meal, many even waiting in block-length bread lines to be fed. Probably one of the most iconic images from the Great Depression, this photo of a line for a soup kitchen in Chicago is just one instance of the widespread hunger of the vastly unemployed. Not only does this image capture many's reliance on soup kitchens to provide meals for them, but it also depicts the government's failure to aid its ailing unemployed. The line in the photograph is actually for a soup kitchen that was organized by the notorious Al Capone, which goes to show the charity done by private organizations in the absence of aid from state and federal governments. This next photo depicts a breadline outside of a Franciscan church. Although the image, like the last one, shows a breadline that would have been common in cities of the 1930s America, this specific image portrays the extreme outreach of soup kitchens of churches and charities. The massive queue of people waiting for a meal puts into perspective the vastness of unemployment during the almost decade of economic downturn. Aside from the depiction of unemployment, this breadline photograph also communicates how needed government unemployment relief was, with the impact of charity soup kitchens having to make up for that. Lastly, this final picture, which is unlike the others two, portrays up close the people of these massive breadlines. Unlike the last two, this final photograph's more intimate quality captures the universal effects felt by the Great Depression. The 5 main subjects of the image sat waiting in line ranges in ages young and old, and male and female. Thus, the image in its subjects showcases the diverse demographic of people relying on these soup kitchens.
During the Great Depression, which began in 1929 and lasted about a decade, shanty towns appeared across America as unemployed people were evicted from their homes. As the Depression worsened in the 1930s, many looked to the federal government for assistance. When the government failed to provide relief, President Herbert Hoover was blamed for the intolerable economic and social conditions, so the shanty towns that were cropped up became known as Hoovervilles, squatter camps, or hobo jungles. This photo depicts a Hooverville built in Central Park. In the 1930s, New York City Central Park was home to a small shanty town that residents experiencing homelessness built. Actually, the city tried to erase all traces of its unfortunate past, but failed. In this photo, the homeless sit outside their huts in Manhattan, New York. Settlers without legal claims, derisively called squatters, had been moving into the Midwest for years before 1776. They pushed further and further down the Ohio River during the 1760s and 1770s, and sometimes engaged in conflict and competition with Native Americans. Finally, in this photo, the photo shows a man sleeping by the docks in 1935. Hundreds of thousands, no one knows how many, took to the streets, finding what shelter they could under bridges, in culverts, or on vacant public land where they could build crude shacks. Some cities allowed squatter encampments for a time, while others did not.
The next topic we'll be talking about is the bonus army of the Great Depression. During the interwar period, when the Great Depression took place, there was a great demand by World War I veterans to be adequately compensated for the time they served in the war. Due to this demand, a 1924 congressional bill was passed that guaranteed underpaid veterans to be able to cash a certificate by 1945 in exchange for money, but it was ultimately reacted to with distaste. When the stock market crashed in 1939, thousands of now unemployed veterans became desperate to receive their compensation, and in 1932, many marched to Washington, D.C. to petition Congress to pass a new bill. That summer, a new bonus bill failed to pass the Senate, and the many veterans who made their way to D.C. and camped outside of Capitol Hill awaiting a verdict refused to disperse. In response, President Hoover ordered their removal, and the night of June 15, 1932, the occupying war veterans were met with the U.S. Army, who used tear gas, tanks, and cavalry to remove them, burning the camps set up by the petitioners. This photograph of the bonus army, which depicts their occupation of Capitol Hill, shows the extent many war veterans took to petition for the compensation they deserved. The crowd of men sprawled out on the lawn of the Capitol in the image goes to show the garnered support of veterans behind their petition of the new bonus bill in the wake of the Great Depression. This next image of the bonus army features the aftermath of the removal at the hands of the U.S. Army. On a nearby portion of Washington, D.C., petitioners and their families set up camp across the Anacostia River, where in the aftermath of the Senate blocking of the bonus bill, the settlements of the veterans and their families were burned and destroyed. The photograph seen here was aptly captured and printed widespreadly in newspapers documenting the event. Americans nationwide were shocked and disturbed by the violence of the federal government and ultimately favored and sided with the bonus army. This last photo is of General Douglas MacArthur, who received the command by Hoover to direct the removal of the bonus army. The decorated general in his uniform portrays the course of action the federal government took in handling the bonus army. The image's portrayal demonstrates Hoover's mishandling of the event and overall reflects the entirety of the federal government's handling of the Great Depression and the countless effects on the American people.
The final topic that we will be talking about is general poverty during the Great Depression. And by the end of 1932, over 50,000 New York citizens were experiencing homelessness. In New York City, the bread lines and soup kitchens were packed, serving 85,000 meals a day. Now, the first image that we will be looking at shows a family suffering even 10 years after the Great Depression. The mother hides her face as young children smile unknowingly. The children in the picture were actually sold, and the substantial and long-lasting effects of the Great Depression can be seen as Americans continue to struggle with poverty and basic survival. The photographer likely intended to convey the great desperation of these times, as the parents gave up their children as they felt that they had no other way of surviving. And this next image pictured over here shows a homeless man who is living in filth and is surrounded with junk, likely living in a Hooversville. And unemployment levels during the Great Depression reached as high as 24.9% in 1933, and even by 1939, over 60% of rural households and 82% of farm families were classified as impoverished. The photographer likely wanted to capture the heartbreaking conditions that these homeless faced. And the final picture we will be looking at over here was described as a kitchen nightmare, which was frequently seen during the Great Depression, with bare cabinets, filthy walls, floors, and appliances, as the poverty led families to grow up in unsanitary conditions with very little food. The photographer likely intended to portray the terrible conditions that many young children were forced to grow up in as a result of their parents being jobless and likely too discouraged by the uncertainty of the times to look after their own kids.